healthcare is somewhat unique, both in terms of the market need, in terms of cyber attack, high value, those types of things. We know that healthcare records are very high value, massive surface area of attack. The previous speaker talked about the medical devices, and how challenging it can be to secure things that are unsecurable. We can't patch them. So all of those types of challenges makes for an interesting community story. Joining me, introduced was Ryan Wynn, Chief Information Security Officer for Munson Healthcare. Our firm is a security services provider. Ryan's firm is a consumer of those services, and we thought it might be quite beneficial to share both perspectives here with you today. So here's how it started. We were meeting with a client, long-term client, and it's a CISO of a large healthcare system. He said, man, got this challenge. What do you guys think we can do about this? We got a call from the governor of the state of Michigan. Really wants us to engage with other healthcare organizations to form some sort of healthcare working group, talking group. What do you think we should do here? We said, well, let's just start. Let's just call, bring together the participants from different healthcare organizations, and just start communicating and see where it goes. And literally it started with that simple meeting and call to action from the governor, and resulted in the creation of the Michigan Healthcare Cybersecurity Council. Now, that was really just the spark of the healthcare community addressing cyber challenges. What we felt was particularly interesting is we were the second one to go. The first one that formed at the request of the governor was energy, another good sector for collaboration. What took us back a little bit, though, was the guidance that we received. And it was, now, don't get too far ahead of yourself. I mean, really all we want to do here is just get in a room and talk. But don't really feel compelled to put anything into action. And that was sort of the mindset at the time. And how great it is that that mindset has now changed. That through events like this, the call is to put things into action. But there was, in fact, some, I guess, well-founded concern at that time. You know, why wouldn't we put things into action? Well, some of the learnings that we came to discover, cyber was kind of the dark secret. If you were hacked, the idea wasn't that you let people know about it. The idea was to suppress it. You didn't want people to know that you were hacked. And we've come a long way into, hey, this should be shared. What a great advantage of the council now to have that trust established. The trust established in a public-private consortium. That those that are even regulating the healthcare industry can be trusted to share information that's related to security and breaches. That it doesn't have to be a dark secret. We felt that that was really great progress. It also helped with the recognition that healthcare really is a critical infrastructure component. Even more so now that records are tied together, that healthcare systems are no longer standalone, that the records, the diagnostics, those types of things that Ryan can share with you in great detail, how integrated healthcare is as a delivery mechanism to protect the citizens of our state. So here's where we took it in learnings from the early days. The first thing in community, face-to-face really works well. I don't have to tell you all that. You came to this event because, gosh, how much better is it to have conversations at lunch, to communicate with one another rather than just tune into a video channel. That face-to-face really works to establish common purpose, to have meaningful dialogue, and we set that rhythm of face-to-face communication every quarter. That rotates throughout the state. Great learning for establishing the initial community. Second thing that we looked at ad hoc communication is really beneficial at this stage in cyber community. That just having something as simple as an email thread, as a call list, as a, hey, what are you seeing or what do you know about these types of things? It's all it takes to get a great start in information security community. Focus was a tough lesson early on. From the initial couple of meetings when we were just forming, saying, hey, what do we really want this thing to be? To taking that first initiative to what do we actually want to accomplish? The list was long. The list soon became longer than the number of people in the room to actually work on the items on the list. So we had to down select and focus just on 3 items to get started. And I would encourage in any community to really get that focus down to something that's truly actionable. And we found just that. We were really, I think, of great benefit that healthcare naturally has trust for the process and for one another. That patients can be shared amongst healthcare, records are shared amongst healthcare. That I think we were really fortunate to start with healthcare because there's trust in sharing. There's also, I think, trust in the potential for outcome of sharing, of getting beyond, hey, what are we sharing, but more importantly, why are we sharing it? And we reinforce that trust frequently in the council. And then perhaps most importantly, experience is the best teacher. When we look at what gets shared, those real-world experiences become so much more beneficial to the audience, both in the room, but out of the room and beyond. And I'll give you sort of an example that relates to the previous talk. When we look at things like a tabletop exercise, great start. How do we make it better? We talk about real-world experiences, or we share real-world experiences. In a tabletop, it quickly becomes decoupled from the reality, right? We get in the room, make some meaningful communication. But when we actually trace it back to the healthcare system and what actually occurred, and there's willingness to then take that story beyond essentially the council back into the healthcare systems to train people, tremendously meaningful. So a lot of great progress within the community. Okay, I'm going to go back to those top 3 priorities. We talked about what do we focus on and what are the top 3 priorities. One of those top 3 priorities was incident response. Recognizing that we were challenged in healthcare and incident response. We were challenged at that point with even having incident response plans that were beyond the checkbox. So it was a natural place and a good place for us to start. When we looked at incident response, we looked at it from the perspective of saying, how can we advance the maturity of incident response for healthcare as a whole? We came together and some of that initial progress was, well, gosh, we can create an incident response plan that we all share and understand. And then we can match that incident response plan to the internalization of each organization. And it was a good start. Moving past that good start, we had a wonderful willingness to share. We already had this trust relationship, and people were generally gung-ho to say, yep, we're willing to share event and incident-related information. We said, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to share? First attempt was, well, when you see something, say something. When you see something, go ahead and broadcast it to the group. It's had a massive time lag challenge. Usually what would happen is by the time somebody said something, they were just coming up for air after like 2 weeks of absolute hell. The organization was decimated. Finally, they come up for air and say, oh, by the way, do I have a story for you guys? This was a rough couple of weeks. So that time delay, we found, really didn't work, both for the benefit of the organization that had the significant event or breach, as well as for the broader community. So we said, well, let's take the next attempt. There's others that have gone before us. We looked at some of the ISOC models. We said, wow, there's a lot of threat indicators out there. Maybe we can get all that stuff in real time. We stood up Social Edge, said, let's get Styx Taxi going. And in concept, it was fantastic. In reality, it was a massive distributed denial of service attack against our key resources. We just blew people over. In 2 years, it never was to the point of operationalization. It was just running, spitting, replicating in the background. So we had gone a couple rounds and certainly didn't find success. So doing what we often do when we don't, we get a napkin out, we share some snacks and a drink in an afternoon. And what results? Even bigger ideas. This really had some merit, the idea of going bigger within this community. We recognized that if we stayed at the level of obscurity by noise, we'd have a really tough time getting there. We knew that if we didn't go bigger and get operationally integrated, we'd have a really tough time getting where we wanted to go, something that was actionable. So in going bigger, we laid out a couple of the requirements to say, what would that mean and who would we want involved on this path to really making this happen, to really making a true shared and actionable environment for healthcare. The SOC, what does your SOC really do, is ultimately what we wanted to set out. What do we really want to be when we grow up? And here's our key findings from that. The first thing we found was a flexible vendor. We recognized very quickly that just putting this as a, hey, we also do information sharing, was difficult for the participants. Healthcare will often share that, and it's not too far, unlike other industries, short-staffed, resource-constrained. That it's very difficult to get additional staffing in security and healthcare. So, searching for a flexible vendor that could adapt to this new creation of a model. Commitment to a sector. Recognizing that healthcare is unique, healthcare has certain components or contexts that need to be understood in order to protect. Clinical systems, medical devices. Ryan's world has a lot of uniqueness. So wanted to make sure that we had a commitment to the healthcare sector, that it was sector specific. Next item up, data use agreements. How do we satisfy the legal realm? How do we make sure that the risk is appropriately addressed? And legally, we're covered to share data amongst these participants that are coming into a shared SOC. What code of ethics would we establish? This is essentially the vetting. Who do you want at the table? Who do you want in your foxhole? What code of ethics do we want them to be bound by? Thought through that in advance. Went through the governance structure. Went through what happens if we create intellectual property out of this consortium. How would we address intellectual property? Who gets to use it? What about publication rights? What if information is discovered about one participant? Can it be published amongst the participants? Can it be published in a broader format? Because the intention of this group was to create a benefit for healthcare, wherever healthcare may be, the entirety of the service delivery model, beyond just the participants within this HSOC model. So a lot of big challenges. Like any big challenge that's worth it, we wanted to take on and say, you know, if this is worth doing and we're going to go bigger, let's think twice about it. But that said, let's make sure that the model provides for technology expertise, perhaps first and foremost, Flex and surge staffing, the participants generally share that they do not have 24/7 staffing. Some of that nuts and bolts of what people often outsource a SOC to do, provide that key staffing level. That the intelligence and the visibility and the attribution is healthcare specific. That those meaningful indicators are digested and are presented in a meaningful way to healthcare. And then finally, that we have sector outreach. That once we build this for the benefit of the participants, that we reach out through the entirety of the healthcare sector. Initially, it started out with 2 participants that said, hey, we're in. One of those participants led and said, we'll go out with these requirements, and we'll run an RFP. We'll run an RFP to search for the operating partner. We're here today because ultimately we won that RFP and came in to provide this glue amongst the participants. Extended this model of the shared SOC amongst the healthcare participants with state-level interaction. Remember, we were born from essentially a call from the governor. We were mindful of wanting to integrate back to the state, potentially to other areas. The first integration that we found with the state was the Air National Guard. The Air National Guard had stood up a cyber capability and wanted to test this concept of Cyber Hub. I can tell you we weren't quite ready to go there, but what we did find was a common purpose, again, a willingness to share, and ultimately we found a roadmap that allows us to get to that point of very active sharing. So we made it to step 1 in that state-level interaction with the Air National Guard. We created a curriculum with the university such that participants within the Air National Guard can sign on for their 6-year reserve duty status, get the basic training within the Air National Guard SOC, go immediately into university, immediately come into the healthcare SOC, all with a common curriculum that's shared across those 6 years. It's about 3 years through pre-SOC, 3 years after SOC. So we're just laying this in. We believe that ultimately that commonality will help with additional state sharing. Took the inaugural participant and began adding additional participants. And that's essentially where we are today, is that role of adding additional healthcare participants, having that initial state level functionality, and potentially adding additional sector partners. Where we think this can ultimately go with a proven model is to interface through the state to other areas of critical infrastructure. We're tracking with energy and financial services most directly. So sort of in our side view mirrors, we're keeping an eye on those sectors as ultimately places where the community can expand and share information. We feel that we're fairly new at this because we hunted around to find where the idea existed. Department of Defense did provide us with some guidance. They did some research and published a white paper on the Cyber Hub model. So often doing what we do, we say, well, in this hub and spoke model of multiple participants, who's actually done this? We struggled to find that, but we did find somebody that studied doing it. So we said, hey, that's the next best thing. We're going to take and learn from whatever we can in this pursuit. And that's why we're happy to share this with you today. We feel we're in really great company because those things that we were focused on, we found a great home here in Maryland that's pursuing that. What we liked about this hub and spoke model is that direct sharing. We liked in the hub and spoke model that the idea is to go bi-directional as quickly as possible. The thing that we expanded on in the hub and spoke model is the challenge that we found with getting beyond sort of the sandbox too quickly. A lot of the models are identified with moving across to separate side of the rooms, moving across to separate parts of the city, moving across to separate parts of the country. And we really felt compelled that we need to draw people closer together in order to make the community work. And I'm going to tell you more about that. the ultimate rationale for why we moved forward with the Cyber Hub model, the recognition that the adversary works great as a team. They share a tremendous amount of information on the dark web. We were suppressing information and sharing it in a very generic rather than a specific way. We said we have to be able to make a single team to address cybersecurity. We want to treat this like a sport. We said we have to get rid of that delay. We have to get rid of that lag where we suffered from it being too little too late and make the sharing real time. So we set out with that mindset of, let's make sure we're working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, real-time communication. I already shared with you we were intent on making it healthcare specific. And then ultimately taking the learnings from the HSOC and providing a direct talent path back in. And we find that not only is turnover high in security operations centers, it's higher when you talk about nights and weekends, and ultimately people go off and have families and do other things. So you want to sort of get back to the light of day. We said let's know that and build that into the process for the benefit of the participants by having a talent chain that's already ready to go in and act within their organizations. Essentially an extensibility of the SOC back to those that it serves. So what is the SOC actually doing today? Now that it has stood up, sharing information, the first thing, to your point, what are you doing within the SOC? First and foremost, event triage and response. We're intaking meaningful information, assigning it metadata, prioritizing that information, providing triage and response services. This is the first view. So this is an air cover view for the participants. The first step was taking a step and looking and saying, well, gosh, the reason why it didn't work in the first place was because the indicators were overrunning those that are frontline responsible for acting on the events. If we take that away and we provide the triage and the prioritization, we free up the critical time for those resources to actually secure their organization. Okay, the next thing that we do is we provide event aggregation analysis and reporting. This is really distilling down what's meaningfully generated internally and providing that feedback loop in order to tune other participants' environments. And this is the sort of part of the equation where we've already entered the state where, well, gosh, our environment is completely unique. Completely unique except for where the use cases are nearly identical with other healthcare organizations, where the medical record structure looks almost identical, where the patient records are actually visible and appear in multiple healthcare organizations simultaneously. You know, where although I'm a patient admitted in one place, maybe my doctor is affiliated with another healthcare organization, there's a lot of cross that takes place. A lot of the medical devices are the same or similar. So we found far more commonality than we had originally anticipated. The next component, and this one we feel is pretty unique. I think I had shared with you that the council had taken on tabletop exercises, had done a lot of research into building up a cyber range. And very similar to what we found with the threat indicators coming from the outside, we have so much material to work with inside, and that, in an enriched way, provides us an ability to train on the real data rather than train in the cyber range or train on a tabletop. With this open trust model, it creates a wonderful opportunity to say, hey, let's go live fire. Literally this morning, John and I were on this is my colleague John. John and I were on a conference call, 2 participants talking about real world scenarios and how we can train in those real world scenarios. We recognize that there's risk in doing that. We feel that that risk is well warranted from the perspective of this activity is already nefarious actor activity in the environment. the damage is it's ongoing. If we take this approach where we can go into live fire and learn in that environment, not only are the lessons timely and relevant, there's a lot of stick. Sort of talking about a live round zooming by my head is a little bit different than actually feeling it tickle my hairs. So we know there's a lot of stick in live exercises. And I shared with you the resource recruiting and retention and why we feel that's meaningful as well. And one of the things that we found most interesting about this pursuit, and I'm curious to get Ryan's perspective on this as well, is this enclave concept of having the participants work side by side, to having a common place to go, and to literally work as one team. This can be seen as somewhat challenging in the environment where bits and bytes are flying and we want to be virtual, support for virtual SOCs. We decided to go with essentially a hybrid model so we can support virtual capability, but we're seeing so much value out of the participants being side by side in the same facility. And I would really encourage that to the greatest extent practical, to be able to have the entities participate in the same facility. Having a cup of coffee with somebody and talking just in a very open dialogue format can be far more meaningful than sharing a threat indicator on the screen.
I mean, what's the lowest level of SOC? And as you reach down into your sector, is it a mom and pop doctor's office? Is it a hospital? How far do you go down?
As of right now, it's really larger healthcare systems because they're the ones who have the ability to come in and fund and develop and resource.
Right.
But what you say actually has a lot of meaning because you look at healthcare organizations, the easiest place to get us from a security standpoint is not head on. It's going to be all the partners that we have. It's going to be all of the smaller physician offices. It's going to be all the affiliated small facilities. In our region of the state, we actually have more critical access hospitals than anything else. We're primarily rural. And we have to connect with them. We have to support them from a technology perspective to keep them afloat because it's really hard to be a standalone small hospital in this day and age. So I think the vision going forward is really to provide this basic infrastructure where you have people with resources developing sort of the model and then pull the smaller facilities and the smaller players in. Because ultimately, healthcare is really kind of an ecosystem. You talk about sharing this information back and forth. And honestly, I'm connected to everybody. Everybody that we deal with in the SOC, we're connected to both from a network and a business operations perspective. And it goes well beyond that. If you look at who we partner with from a small hospital perspective, we're connected to literally everybody. So this is one area where it just doesn't pay to compete. We all want to have a level of security. And that's kind of the momentum behind it is start with the bigger, move towards the smaller, protect the entire ecosystem.
One of the benefits of having people present
From the business and sort of healthcare provider perspective, what this gives us an opportunity to do is work at scale. So, my organization is about $1 billion organization. The other organizations that we're dealing with are $4 and $5 billion organizations. They don't see a lot of these security events happen very frequently because they're not big enough to see security events happen very frequently. When we amass all of these feeds together and we're responding at scale, it's a lot quicker to get people up to speed and see a variety of different things from a security perspective. And it's a little bit like the lottery for us too, because we're a 1 in 3 chance of actually being the first one hit. And then we're able to respond much quicker than we would otherwise. So to a certain extent, I think the minutia and the details and all the garbage that you go through to put a SIM in place in the SOC, that does get taken away from the exercise. And what you're focusing on then, instead of all the bits and bytes, you really are focusing at learning at scale. And I think that's
the process,
advantageous.
the learning, the knowledge sharing, as opposed to the technique of sharing information. It's more
Right.
the value and result of sharing knowledge to figure out what's action, what drives action and what does not.
Well, and that's the difference between just getting a feed of threats and, actually participating in it. Even if your organization is not hit, ultimately it's very different seeing some, actionable sort of security event take place, being a part of its resolution, feeling that deeply, even if it wasn't your organization that you're kind of supporting and moving forward, than it is to get a list of feeds that you don't necessarily know how to prioritize or digest.
what is the boundary for your HSOC? Like, so you start to get into like the IT and the ops side. So like if you do incident response, you may have to pull emails or rebuild machines, or maybe you have a web server that is been compromised and you need to rebuild that. How do you just send tickets to have the organization's IT department handle it, or would the people on the watch floor handle part of that as well?
So the people on the watch floor participate in that, as well as we bring people in from the participating organizations to essentially train and operationalize in the facility. So the resources go in both directions in that resource flow. In addition, there's offers to assist from participant A to participant B. So we've seen, a certain organization has expertise. They've expressed, hey, willingness. I understand you have that challenge. I have really great capability here in forensics, for example. Why don't I go ahead and deploy a resource? So it's to the greatest extent full collaboration and operating as a single team. A little bit of the technology stack and how it gets there. We already talked about the incident response plan commonization, and we sort of filter down and attempt to normalize. Each organization can still have an individual incident response plan, but we tend to look from an operational perspective at how do we normalize that. The second thing that we did was we said, well, we can be fully technology agnostic. There's a lot of value in having common playbooks. There's a lot of value in creating the similarity from the HSOC perspective. And then the participants' general feedback is, well, gosh, that's only 2 degrees different from how we had it built anyway. Let's go ahead and adopt that. That's worth having as a common capability. So I think much to your point, we can act with very different SIMs, very different endpoint security capabilities, and we roll all that up and normalize that with Syncurity's solution, because we find it very good at interfacing in a common way with disparate platforms.
So just a question, Sequris, so your role is you're managing the overall SOC operations, or what? Okay.
We do. So our role is we're the operating partner. We're governed by, and I'll advance to this so Ryan can address this in a little greater detail. We're governed by a steering committee. So while we have direct services that are delivered to each participant, ultimately the participants collectively govern us. And we find that much better, obviously, because we get essentially one set of marching orders.
Yeah, it makes it easier for you.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and it's amazing, it hasn't really been much of an issue because, at least in our space, because it's industry specific, and one healthcare organization is different as they think they are from the next is very similar.
Right.
So when we put our list of needs together, we usually come up with very similar sorts of needs, very similar sorts of metrics, very similar needs from a response time perspective, those sorts of things. So it sounds, it is kind of a grandiose effort to pull a bunch of disparate healthcare systems that are very big and political and unwieldy and all those sorts of things together. But at the same time, the actual act of making decisions and kind of moving in the same direction isn't something that really is as challenging as you might imagine.
The steering committee also guides us. There were some questions about scale. And this fourth bullet point, the preservation of a higher purpose. That preservation of higher purpose is how do we serve all of healthcare? Ryan mentioned that they have a lot of rural healthcare participation. And in Michigan, we call it north of the 45th, beautiful land, lots of it. How do we serve the participants north of the 45th? And we haven't fully answered that yet, but we're committed to answering it. And it does involve scaling in a new and different way. We know part of that answer is to utilize the existing infrastructure and capability, to utilize the SOAR technologies. To some extent, increasing the level of automation and normalizing the stack and how we deliver that service. And at this stage in the game, a lot of active listening. John is headed, when are you headed to the UP? Next week. So UP is Upper Peninsula in Michigan next week to talk to 5 rural healthcare providers in the Upper Peninsula. So to really give us feedback about what is important to that constituency, and how do we start to build that bridge? But very intent on providing services to healthcare providers of all sizes.
The personnel that staff it, are they typically entry, mid, senior, a mix? How do you determine what kind of people a company is sending to contribute to this? Is that like they ask for a certain level, or is it up to the company participating?
Sure, it's a 3-to-1 ratio, so essentially the junior tier, the mid-tier to the senior tier, about a 3-to-1 ratio. And we look for someone with, if an entity is going to be providing a resource, they're providing context and communication. So having it be someone that's already familiar with the organization is really what's key. So they can say, oh, well, we know this is what Dr. So-and-so needs. We know certain systems that are important. A lot of the things that Ryan would want his team to know already, to be able to introduce that into the SOC.
Does that mean that they can, in some cases, it can be people very familiar with the organization, but perhaps new to the security side, let's say someone that moved from IT or something, or it's not usually that way in practice?
It is that way in practice, actually.
Yeah,
it is.
And sometimes preferable.
You know, I think what's true about at least 2 of the 3 participants is we've never done SOC activities before. We haven't tried to build our own SOC. It's just, you know, that's not the business we're in. Healthcare and SOC is something that you either outsource or, you know, you figure out a different way to deal with it. But in our case, even though we're sending, you know, relatively seasoned security people, they're on incident response policy and procedure, the technical controls, those sorts of things. And then they're learning the SOC business. And that's actually really exciting to them is, you know, how does this work? And it's a level of complexity and sophistication that you don't often get in the healthcare environment when you're dealing with information security. So that's why I've got a pile of people who want to go down to Plymouth every week and participate in the exercise.
Essentially, what a participant is doing is, first and foremost, they're coming in and they're understanding the triage as a single unit or a single team. So they're coming in and participating in twice daily calls and seeing what's taking place across healthcare for all of the participants. So that's sort of the base level to play within the environment, is to be able to understand the metadata, understand the prioritization. From that, they essentially pivot and look back into their own environment. So that's the specific alerts and tool sets and capabilities that are present within the participant's own technology stack. So we look at the extraction and the metadata, and then we help that inform activity back into the participant's organization. And that's where we look for the feedback about particular types of systems, applications, workflow. That's also where, when we go through our tuning exercises, one of the key requirements that we had was we have to be able to get workflow integrated. So that's sort of an entry level to play. You know, if we talk about the ante up, workflow integration is part of that key to anteing in. There's many that say, hey, just give us the feeds, but we don't want to share anything back. And that can be a start of sharing, but it really doesn't get the traction. That was one of our first learnings, was that was a failure point for us. We also looked and said, well, information security is sort of a common challenge. Information security, whether or not it's at our SOC or if it's within an organization, there's a risk of it being decoupled from the operation. That the general sysadmins and network staff and those types of things, they end up being decoupled. So workflow integration is absolutely imperative. Part of the technology stack in looking at a SOAR capability is the API strong, and can we get workflow integrated? Can we get into the ticketing system? Can we get into the general change management and database systems? And when we do that, we look and say, wow, we can really create a lot of commonality. And that's the platform for that communication.
And depending on where, you know, a security event happens within an organization, if you're just kind of a SOC analyst and you don't understand the way the business works, you don't know the criticality of it, but, you know, healthcare is one of those businesses where if you get hit in the wrong place, it's people's lives, you know, a risk. So we want to be able to provide the expertise to say, yeah, that is really a big issue, even though it may not seem like it just from a pure technical perspective.
It sounded like you had outsourced it earlier. to a third
We
party or
had not. We were actually in the process of evaluating when this opportunity came up, and we decided to go this direction. But, provided, sort of equal levels of service, one that has an expertise in healthcare is going to just blow the doors off of one that does not. So, and we feel a sense of ownership in this model too. It's kind of cool vendor technology, and we like working with Sequris, but we feel like we own this thing. So we're invested in a way that's maybe a little bit different from your typical outsourced SOC relationship.
I think we're done here. I just wanted to thank you guys for coming and just offer a closing comment. We come to these events here and we hear a lot of talk about data formats and ontology and a lot of theory. And I think what's really been great about today is you've got to hear a couple of people who've really put a lot of these tenets into practice in a real way, and hear some of the challenges that they've encountered. And it just kind of gets back to, at the end of the day, what I like to say about this space in general is that it's a journey. Right? Everything in this space is a journey. Nobody's journey is identical. But the important thing is to understand that as you set out and work towards that destination of creating a more secure environment for everybody. So, thanks, guys.